What happens when privilege collides with justice? Watch as an arrogant socialite faces a no-nonsense judge and learns a life lesson she will never forget. That morning, the courtroom was packed, buzzing with a quiet murmur as people shuffled into their seats. It was just another typical day at the Los Angeles County Courthouse, except for one detail. This hearing was about to draw attention. Tiffany Holstead, a socialite notorious for her reckless behavior and inflated sense of self, was due to stand before Judge William Grant. Known for his unshakable demeanor and sharp intellect, Judge Grant was highly respected in the legal community as a fair but firm arbiter of justice. Tiffany arrived as she always did, late and unapologetic. Draped in designer labels and oversized sunglasses, she strutted into the courtroom as though it were a red carpet event. Her lawyer, visibly uncomfortable, hurried behind her, trying to minimize the scene. The courtroom, accustomed to decorum, fell silent as eyes shifted toward her. She stopped in the aisle, seemingly unaware of the people waiting for her to sit. With a dismissive wave, she motioned for her lawyer to move aside so she could place her bag on the bench. Her entitlement was evident as she dramatically removed her sunglasses, glancing around as if the entire situation was beneath her. Moments later, Judge Grant entered, and the air in the room shifted instantly. The murmur faded, replaced by a respectful hush. In his mid-50s, Grant was an imposing figure with a tall frame and a calm authority. His sharp eyes scanned the room briefly before settling into his chair. "All rise," the bailiff announced. Tiffany hesitated, clearly irritated, before standing with a heavy sigh. Her expression screamed, "Why am I even here?" Judge Grant didn't react. He adjusted his glasses, opened the file before him, and began the proceedings. Tiffany's case was fairly straightforward. Parking violations compounded by a reckless driving incident that endangered a pedestrian. But what could have been a routine hearing was about to take a dramatic turn due to Tiffany's arrogance. As Judge Grant began outlining the charges, Tiffany's posture shifted. She leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, rolling her eyes, a blatant sign of disrespect that didn't go unnoticed. But instead of addressing her behavior, Judge Grant continued with calm professionalism. His tone was measured, his words deliberate. It was almost as if he were daring her to continue the act. Tension started to build in the room, and even the most seasoned court regulars sat up straighter, sensing something was brewing. But Tiffany, oblivious to the storm she was inviting, had no intention of backing down. She shifted in her seat, her irritation growing with every word Judge Grant spoke. She began tapping her manicured nails against the wooden table, loud enough for those nearby to hear. Her lawyer leaned in, whispering something urgently, but Tiffany dismissed him with a flick of her hand. The already tense room seemed to hold its breath when Judge Grant asked her to confirm her identity. "Yeah, that's me," she replied, barely looking up, her tone dripping with indifference. A collective murmur rippled through the room. Judge Grant's expression remained calm, but his eyes lingered on Tiffany for a moment longer than usual. "Miss Holstead," he began, his voice steady. "In this courtroom, we adhere to a certain level of decorum. I suggest you adjust your tone accordingly." Tiffany smirked, as if the judge's words were a joke. Leaning back, she twirled a strand of her blonde hair around her finger. "Sure thing, Your Honor," she said, her voice oozing with sarcasm. Gasps echoed softly through the room. The court reporter paused briefly before continuing. Even Tiffany's lawyer buried his face in his hands, visibly mortified. Judge Grant, however, remained unfazed. "Miss Holstead," he said again, his voice firm but calm, "do you understand the charges brought against you today?" Tiffany rolled her eyes once more, audibly sighing. "Honestly, no. I mean, it's just some dumb parking tickets, and what? Someone got scared because I hit the gas too hard? "This is a waste of time," she muttered. The courtroom fell silent. All eyes were now on Judge Grant, who carefully closed the folder before him. He deliberately placed his glasses on the bench. For a moment, it seemed as though time itself had paused. "Miss Holstead," he said slowly, his voice calm yet unmistakably authoritative, "I would advise you to choose your words carefully from this point forward." The gravity of his tone caused even the most disinterested court spectators to sit up straighter. But Tiffany, still oblivious to the seriousness of the situation, simply shrugged. "What's it to you?" She leaned forward this time. "It's not like I hurt anyone. This whole thing is ridiculous." But what Tiffany failed to realize was that her words were no longer falling on deaf ears. Judge Grant's silence spoke volumes, and the courtroom was about to witness a response they would never forget. Leaning back in his chair, Judge Grant fixed Tiffany with a piercing gaze. The room remained silent, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone, even Tiffany's lawyer, who had stopped nervously shuffling papers and glanced at the judge. "You think this is ridiculous, Miss Holstead?" Judge Grant asked, his tone steady yet carrying undeniable authority. He didn't raise his voice, but it was impossible to ignore the power in his words. Tiffany scoffed. "Yeah, I do. I mean, come on, it's not like I robbed a bank or something. This is just overkill." She waved her hand dismissively, as though brushing away an insignificant nuisance. Judge Grant nodded slowly, folding his hands on the bench. "I see," he said, his calm demeanor only heightening the suspense. The spectators leaned in, closer to the edge of their seats. "Let me clarify something for you, Miss Holstead," he continued. "The charges against you include not only reckless driving but also endangering a pedestrian's life. The law does not measure accountability by the size of the crime, but by its impact. Do you understand?" Judge Grant's calm tone contrasted sharply with the growing tension in the room. Tiffany rolled her eyes again, muttering under her breath, "Sure, sure, whatever you say." The whisper was soft, but it cut through the silence of the courtroom. The judge's face remained composed, yet there was a noticeable shift. His eyes narrowed ever so slightly, signaling a change was coming. "Miss Holstead," Judge Grant began, his voice still calm, "do you remember the incident from 2 weeks ago, the one that brought you here today?" Tiffany shrugged, her expression bored. "Some guy stepped off the curb. I honked, he moved. End of story." Judge Grant raised his eyebrows. "End of story, you say?" "Yeah," she replied, crossing her arms. "No harm, no foul." But Judge Grant wasn't done. He reached for a document on the bench, flipping through it with precision. Then he addressed the courtroom. "Let the record show," he said, his voice commanding, "that the pedestrian in question, Mr. Edward Lopez, is a 67-year-old retired teacher." He was crossing the street legally when Miss Holstead accelerated toward him, causing him to stumble and injure his wrist. He has since required medical attention and continues to experience pain. For the first time, Tiffany's smirk faltered. She glanced at her lawyer, who whispered something to her, but she waved him off. "I didn't hit him," she muttered. "He was fine." "Miss Holstead," Judge Grant continued, now fully focused on her, "does this sound like no harm, no foul to you?" Before Tiffany could reply, Judge Grant's next move would make it clear that her actions had far-reaching consequences, consequences she could no longer ignore. Judge Grant's gaze remained fixed on Tiffany, his voice steady as he continued. "Miss Holstead, your perspective on this matter is troubling, not because of the charges themselves, but because of your refusal to acknowledge the weight of your actions." Tiffany leaned back in her chair, feigning nonchalance, but the growing tension in the room was impossible to ignore. "Look, I said I didn't hit him. People are so dramatic these days." Her comment sparked a few shocked gasps in the courtroom. Judge Grant lightly tapped his pen against the desk before speaking again. "Dramatic," he repeated, his tone still even. "Would you like to hear from Mr. Lopez himself, Miss Holstead? Because he's here today in this courtroom." The air in the room thickened with anticipation. Tiffany's confident facade wavered, her eyes darting briefly toward the gallery. There, in the second row, sat Mr. Lopez, quiet, his arm in a sling, his face weathered and showing no anger, just a quiet disappointment that seemed more piercing than any harsh words. Tiffany shifted uncomfortably in her seat, but her defiance wasn't entirely gone. "I'm sure he's fine," she muttered, though her voice lacked the earlier bravado. Judge Grant leaned forward slightly, his presence commanding the room. "Miss Holstead," he said, "your dismissal of this man's pain speaks volumes about your character. But this isn't just about him. It's about the precedent we set when individuals of privilege believe they are above accountability." The courtroom was so silent that even the faint scratch of the court reporter's pen could be heard. All eyes were now on Judge Grant, waiting for his next move. Then, with a calmness that belied the gravity of his words, he said, "Since you seem unconcerned about the consequences of your actions, perhaps it's time you experience them firsthand." Tiffany blinked, her earlier bravado crumbling. "What's that supposed to mean?" she asked, her voice tinged with genuine worry for the first time. Judge Grant didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gestured toward the bailiff, who handed him a small stack of papers. The judge began reading aloud, detailing the fines, mandatory community service, and court-ordered sensitivity training Tiffany would need to complete. But it wasn't the penalties themselves that made the biggest impact. It was the way Judge Grant delivered them, sending a powerful message about privilege, empathy, and the responsibility that comes with living in a shared society. What truly shook Tiffany and the entire courtroom, however, was the unexpected final decision, the one that would make her confrontation with reality unavoidable. Judge Grant set the papers down, his gaze steady and unwavering. The weight of his next words seemed to fill the room before they were even spoken. "Miss Holstead," he began, "I have reviewed the details of this case extensively. Given the severity of your actions and your blatant disregard for accountability, I am issuing a sentence that I believe will not only address the legal violations, but also provide you with a much-needed perspective." Tiffany sat up straighter, her earlier flippancy replaced by a flicker of unease. "Perspective," she echoed, her voice edged with disbelief. "Yes," Judge Grant said firmly. "In addition to the fines and 200 hours of community service, you will spend the next 30 days volunteering at the downtown women's shelter. You will work directly with individuals who have faced hardship, often through no fault of their own. Perhaps then you'll understand the impact of carelessness and entitlement." A collective murmur spread through the room. This wasn't the typical sentence one would expect in a case like this. The crowd's reactions were mixed. Some nodded in approval, others exchanged incredulous glances. But the most telling reaction came from Tiffany herself. "You've got to be kidding me," she said, her voice rising. "You want me to what? Hang out with homeless people? That's not my problem." Judge Grant's face didn't change, but his voice grew colder. "Miss Holstead," he said, "it is precisely that mindset that landed you in this courtroom today. Your actions reflect a lack of understanding, a refusal to see how your choices affect those around you. This is not a punishment. It is an opportunity for growth. And let me be clear, failure to comply will result in a much harsher sentence." Tiffany's lawyer tugged at her sleeve, whispering urgently, but she yanked her arm away. "This is insane. You can't force me to do this." Judge Grant raised a hand, silencing her outburst. "Miss Holstead," he said, "this court has the authority to enforce community service as part of your sentence. You will report to the shelter by 8 a.m. each morning, and your supervisor will provide weekly progress updates. Should you fail to cooperate, I will see you back in this courtroom under far less favorable circumstances." The room fell silent once more, the weight of Judge Grant's words hanging heavily in the air. Tiffany's face flushed with anger. For once, Tiffany said nothing. She simply sat there, stunned and silent. But the moment wasn't over yet. Judge Grant's final remarks would leave a lasting impression, not just on Tiffany, but on everyone present in the courtroom. Adjusting his glasses, Judge Grant remained unshaken despite Tiffany's visible defiance. He let the silence stretch, ensuring his next words would land with full impact. "Miss Holstead," he began, "this courtroom isn't here to humiliate or belittle. It's here to uphold justice, and, when possible, to teach. Your privilege has shielded you from consequences for far too long, and it's cost you the ability to empathize. This isn't about punishment. It's about helping you reclaim your humanity." The courtroom held its collective breath. Tiffany, clearly uncomfortable, glanced at the gallery. Her bravado began slipping away, and she opened her mouth as if to speak, but thought better of it. "Do you know what Mr. Lopez said when asked about his feelings toward you?" Judge Grant asked, his voice softer now, almost conversational. Tiffany shook her head, her eyes darting toward Mr. Lopez, who was seated in the gallery. His expression remained one of quiet disappointment. "He said," Judge Grant continued, "I don't want her to suffer. I just want her to understand. Because if she doesn't, she'll keep hurting people, and one day it might be something she can't undo." The words hit hard, and Tiffany's face went pale. For the first time, her defiance crumbled, replaced by discomfort, and maybe even guilt. Judge Grant wasn't finished. "Mr. Lopez, a man you nearly injured, has chosen grace over anger. He could have pressed for harsher penalties, but he asked for something different, an opportunity for you to learn. That's what this sentence represents." Tiffany shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her confidence eroded. The room was so quiet that every small sound, the shuffle of papers, the creak of a bench, seemed amplified. "You will report to the downtown women's shelter on Monday morning," Judge Grant continued. "There, you'll meet women who have faced challenges you can't even begin to imagine. Some have lost everything, others are rebuilding their lives from scratch. You'll listen to their stories, and in doing so, I hope you'll understand the value of humility and accountability." Tiffany looked as if she wanted to protest, but the weight of the moment held her tongue. Her lawyer placed a hand on her arm, signaling for her to stay quiet. Even as the judge's words sank in, the real transformation would only come when Tiffany faced the reality waiting for her outside her sheltered bubble of privilege. The gavel came down with a sharp crack. "This court is adjourned," Judge Grant announced firmly as he rose from his seat and exited the courtroom. The tension in the room lingered, like the remnants of a storm. Tiffany remained seated, her face a mixture of disbelief and indignation. Her lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently, but she barely acknowledged him. As the gallery began to empty, murmurs filled the air, with people discussing what they had just witnessed. Mr. Lopez stood slowly, his arm in a sling, a stark reminder of the incident that had brought them all here. He glanced at Tiffany as he passed, his expression still kind but resolute. Tiffany avoided his gaze, instead staring at the table in front of her. Outside the courthouse, reporters had gathered, eager to capture the fallout from the dramatic hearing. Tiffany's name, long linked to her socialite antics, was now tied to a courtroom moment that had captivated everyone in attendance. Cameras flashed as she emerged, flanked by her lawyer, who shielded her from the barrage of questions. "Miss Holstead, do you have any comment on today's sentencing?" one reporter called. "Do you feel the sentence was fair? What are your thoughts on Judge Grant's decision?" For a moment, Tiffany's usual arrogance resurfaced. "No comment," she snapped, pushing past the crowd and into the waiting car. But once inside, the facade began to crack. As the doors closed and the noise of the reporters faded, her shoulders slumped. For the first time, it seemed reality was setting in. That evening, the story made top headlines across news outlets. Clips from the courtroom, including Judge Grant's powerful words, went viral, sparking widespread discussion. Social media lit up with opinions. Some praised the judge's decision, others criticized Tiffany's behavior. But the most poignant commentary came from Mr. Lopez, who gave a brief statement outside the courthouse. "I don't want her to fail," he said. "I just hope she learns. Because when we stop learning, we stop growing, and that's when we truly lose." The simplicity of his words struck a chord, resonating far beyond the courtroom. For Tiffany, though, the lesson was only beginning. Monday loomed ahead, bringing with it a world far removed from her designer handbags and privileged lifestyle. What Tiffany would soon discover was that real change doesn't come from being told. It comes from seeing, from doing, and from feeling the weight of someone else's reality. Monday arrived with an unfamiliar chill for Tiffany, both in the air and in her chest. She stood outside the downtown women's shelter, her oversized sunglasses hiding the hesitation in her eyes. The building was modest, bustling with activity as volunteers and staff hurried about. For the first time in a long while, Tiffany felt out of place. As she stepped inside, the warm hum of voices and the clatter of kitchen utensils greeted her. A staff member, a woman in her 40s with a no-nonsense demeanor, approached. "You must be Tiffany," she said, her tone friendly but firm. "Welcome. Let's get you started." The hours passed slowly. Tiffany was assigned to help prepare meals, serve food, and clean up afterward. She didn't speak much, keeping her head down, her usual bravado stripped away. But as the day went on, she began to notice things she hadn't before: the gratitude in the smiles of the shelter's guests, the camaraderie among the staff, and the resilience in the stories she overheard. One woman, a single mother of 3, shared her struggles with Tiffany over lunch. "You think you've got it all figured out," she said, her eyes meeting Tiffany's. "But life has a way of teaching you what really matters." That night, as Tiffany drove home, her thoughts were unusually quiet. The faces of the people she'd met lingered in her mind, along with Judge Grant's words. For the first time, she began to wonder if there was more to life than the world she had built for herself, a world of privilege, isolation, and superficiality. In the weeks that followed, Tiffany's mandatory service continued. Day by day, the walls she'd built around herself began to crack. She listened more, spoke less, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to change. By the time her sentence was complete, Tiffany stood before Judge Grant once again. This time, she was a quieter, more introspective version of herself. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady, "for not giving up on me." Judge Grant nodded, his face softening slightly. "The real thanks will come when you take what you've learned and use it to make a difference." As Tiffany left the courthouse, the sun shining brightly overhead, she carried with her a small but powerful hope, a chance to rebuild not just her life, but her perspective. And so Tiffany's journey became a reminder to everyone that change is possible, but it takes humility, courage, and the willingness to confront one's flaws. What will you do today to open your heart and mind to the lessons life has to teach? If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more stories that inspire reflection and growth.